In the heart of suburban Texas, where wide roads cut through gated estates and silence often hides behind trimmed hedges, lived a man who had everything most people chase their entire lives. His name was Richard Hale. Richard Hale was a self-made billionaire. Oil investments, real estate, private equity. The kind of man whose name appeared on buildings, foundations, and quiet donor lists, but rarely in headlines. He didn't crave attention. He didn't need validation. Power to Richard was the ability to stay unseen. Privacy was his greatest luxury. Yet even with all that money, all that control, and all that insulation from the world, there was one thing Richard Hale valued more than everything else combined. His children. Twin boys. Ethan and Oliver. They were 6 years old. Identical in appearance, but different in spirit. Ethan was cautious, observant, always watching the room before speaking. Oliver was fearless, loud, the kind of child who laughed with his whole body. Together, they were Richard's anchor. After the death of their mother years earlier, the twins became the center of his universe, even if his universe often pulled him far away from them. Richard provided everything. The best schools, private tutors, round-the-clock medical care, a staff carefully vetted and quietly paid to keep the household running like clockwork. And according to every professional he hired, the twins were healthy. Perfectly healthy. That's what the reports said. That's what the doctors told him. That's what he chose to believe. Because belief is easier when it aligns with comfort. But while Richard moved between boardrooms and private jets, negotiating deals that shifted markets and shaped cities, something inside his home was slowly, quietly, unraveling. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first it was small things. Easy things to dismiss. Ethan began pushing his plate away at dinner, claiming he wasn't hungry. Oliver, once known for eating anything put in front of him, started gagging at certain meals. Richard noticed, but not deeply. Children go through phases. Then came the flinching. A sudden stiffness when certain staff entered the room. A silence that fell over the twins when voices echoed too loudly in the hall. Richard told himself it was discipline. Structure. Too many adults, too many rules. Still, something felt off. The twins slept poorly on nights when Richard was away. Nightmares. Whispers. Requests for the light to stay on. Yet on the nights when one particular person was nearby, they slept peacefully. That person was the maid. Her name was Mara. Mara wasn't loud. She wasn't warm in the obvious way. She didn't try to be memorable. She did her job, cleaned quietly, spoke only when spoken to, and avoided attention at all costs. Professional. Efficient. Invisible. Which is exactly why Richard never noticed her. To him, she was part of the background, like the walls, the floors, the perfectly trimmed hedges outside. Until patterns began to form. Richard noticed that Ethan and Oliver gravitated toward Mara without being prompted. They followed her with their eyes. They relaxed when she entered the room. And most telling of all, they ate when she was present. Still, Richard didn't connect the dots. He trusted systems. He trusted credentials. He trusted people with titles. Mara had none of those things. And then came the night that changed everything. Richard was in Texas that evening, unable to sleep, the weight of unfinished negotiations pressing on his chest. Instead of calling an assistant or reviewing contracts, he did something he rarely did. He opened the security footage. Not because he suspected anything. Not because he felt danger. But because the house felt too quiet. He scrolled through timestamps, watching empty hallways and still rooms until he paused. 2:17 a.m. Mara entered the twins' bedroom. Richard leaned closer to the screen. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't wake them. She moved with intention. Mara checked Ethan's breathing. Then Oliver. She adjusted their blankets, placed something small beneath their pillows. Then she sat down on the floor. Not on a chair. Not on the bed. On the floor. And she waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Mara didn't move. She didn't scroll on her phone. She didn't fall asleep. She watched them breathe. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. The next night he checked again. The same thing happened. And the night after that. Each time Mara entered quietly, checked their breathing, adjusted their surroundings, and stayed until dawn. This wasn't part of her job. This wasn't normal. Richard replayed the footage again and again, looking for signs of wrongdoing, theft, neglect, anything that made sense. But what he saw instead was vigilance, protection, fear. And that's when a truth Richard Hale had avoided his entire life finally pressed its way into his mind. Something was happening in his house. Something his money hadn't prevented. Something his power hadn't exposed. Something his trust had blinded him to. And the only person who seemed to know the full truth was the one he had never bothered to see. Mara. That night, Richard Hale made a decision that would dismantle his sense of control forever. He wouldn't confront anyone. He wouldn't call the police. He wouldn't alert his lawyers. Instead, he would disappear inside his own home. And watch. Because the man who owned everything had just realized something terrifying. He didn't own the truth. And it was already too late to ignore it. Richard didn't usually watch security cameras. He had a system for that. People for that. Entire departments designed to make sure he never had to look at things himself. But that night sleep refused to come. The house felt too still. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, it warns. So Richard Hale reached for his tablet and opened the live feed. At first there was nothing. Empty hallways. Soft lighting. A house frozen in the illusion of safety. He almost closed the app. Then he noticed the timestamp. 2:17 a.m. Mara stepped into the twins' bedroom. Richard's attention sharpened instantly. She didn't switch on the overhead lights. She didn't call their names. She moved as if she had done this 100 times before. Mara knelt beside Ethan's bed first. She placed 2 fingers near his neck, careful not to wake him, counting silently. She watched his chest rise and fall, her face tight with focus. Then she moved to Oliver. Same routine. Same intensity. Richard leaned closer to the screen. This wasn't casual. This wasn't curiosity. This was procedure. Mara reached into her apron and pulled out something small, too small for the camera to capture clearly. She slid it beneath Ethan's pillow. Then Oliver. After that, she didn't leave. She lowered herself onto the floor between their beds, her back against the wall, legs drawn close, eyes fixed on the boys. And she stayed there. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Richard waited for her to check her phone, for her head to nod forward, for any sign of boredom or fatigue. None came. She didn't blink much. She barely shifted her weight. She simply watched them breathe. Richard felt a slow, creeping unease spread through him. This wasn't how staff behaved when they thought no one was watching. This was how someone behaved when they believed something could go wrong at any moment. He rewound the footage, played it again, And again. The next night, he checked at the same time. 2:17 a.m. Mara entered the room. The same movements. The same checks. The same quiet ritual. The third night confirmed it. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't concern. This was fear. Richard began scrubbing through older footage. Weeks back. Months back. The pattern emerged slowly, unmistakably. Every night when Richard was away, Mara entered the twins' room. Every night she stayed until dawn. Every night she left just before the morning staff arrived. No one else ever knew. And that realization hit harder than anything else. Mara wasn't acting impulsively. She was hiding. Hiding from the staff. Hiding from the doctors. Hiding from the systems Richard trusted. If this was protection, then protection was needed from someone inside the house. Richard's first instinct was anger. His second was fear. His third, the one that stayed, was clarity. Whatever Mara was doing, firing her would end it immediately. And if she was the only thing standing between Ethan and Oliver, and whatever danger lurked in that house, then firing her could be fatal. Richard Hale had spent his life solving problems by removing people. This time he did the opposite. He kept her. And then he made a decision so foreign to his nature that even thinking it felt absurd. He would stop observing from a distance. He would stop relying on reports and intermediaries. He would see the truth himself. Not as the owner of the house. Not as the billionaire whose presence bent conversations and altered behavior, but as someone no one would notice. Someone invisible. Someone beneath the attention of people who believed they were untouchable. Richard Hale decided to disappear inside his own home. To step into the shadows. To become someone else. Because whatever was happening to Ethan and Oliver wasn't an accident. And the only way to uncover the truth was to watch without being seen. Richard Hale hired a replacement gardener. At least that's what the staff believed. The email was simple. A routine notice. One more name added to the long list of people who came and went through the estate without question. No one asked for a background story. No one asked for references. They never did. Because the man signing the checks had already approved it. What no one knew was that the gardener they welcomed through the gate that morning wasn't new at all. It was Richard Hale. For the first time in decades, Richard stripped away everything that identified him. The tailored suits were locked away. The polished shoes replaced with worn-out boots. The clean shave replaced with stubble that made his face unfamiliar even to himself. He pulled on old gloves, a sun-bleached cap, clothes that smelled like dust instead of money. No security detail followed him. No assistants hovered nearby. No one opened doors for him. And something about that unsettled him more than he expected. Because power, he realized, isn't just wealth. It's recognition. And without it, he was invisible. The gates opened. Richard stepped onto his own property as a stranger. No one greeted him by name. No one looked twice. The house loomed ahead, elegant and pristine, the same way it always had, yet it felt different now. Colder. Like a place designed to impress rather than protect. From the garden beds and hedges, Richard watched. He worked slowly. Methodically. Not because the work was difficult, but because watching required patience. And in the first week, what he saw disturbed him deeply. Ethan and Oliver spent more time indoors than before. They moved carefully, as if conserving energy. Their laughter came in short bursts, followed by long silences. Once, Oliver stumbled while running across the lawn. No one rushed to him except Mara. She reached him before anyone else, her hand steady on his shoulder, her voice low and reassuring. The house doctor arrived minutes later. The doctor barely acknowledged the boys before turning to his clipboard. Richard listened from behind a hedge. The doctor asked questions without making eye contact. He adjusted medication schedules without checking vitals. He dismissed Mara entirely. Not once did he ask her what she had observed. Not once did he speak to her directly. Richard's stomach tightened. Later that afternoon, he watched Mara in the kitchen. She stood close as Ethan and Oliver were handed their medications. She didn't interfere. She didn't protest. But she watched every movement. She noted the dosage, the time, the person administering it. And when the twins swallowed, she waited. Only when their breathing steadied did she step back. Richard began to pay attention to the medications themselves. Small bottles, labels he didn't recognize. He had approved prescriptions before, but these were unfamiliar. One afternoon, while trimming hedges near an open window, Richard overheard a quiet exchange. Ethan asked if he could skip his medicine. The doctor said no. Oliver asked why. The doctor said it was just in case. Mara stiffened. Richard saw it. A flash of something crossed her face, fear, maybe anger gone as quickly as it appeared. She said nothing. But later, when the doctor left, she knelt beside the twins and whispered to them. Richard couldn't hear the words, but he saw the result. The twins relaxed. For the first time that day, they smiled. By the end of the week, one truth was undeniable. The house doctor controlled the routine. The staff obeyed without question. And Mara watched everything. She moved through the house like a shadow, never challenging authority openly, never drawing attention. Yet her eyes were always scanning. Doors, cameras, people, especially Richard, or rather the gardener. Their eyes met more than once. Each time, her gaze lingered a fraction longer than it should have, as if she sensed something familiar beneath the dirt and disguise. Richard began to understand something unsettling. Mara wasn't just caring for Ethan and Oliver. She was managing risk, calculating danger, waiting. And for the first time since this began, Richard felt a strange, conflicting emotion. Relief. Because if someone inside that house was paying attention, then maybe his sons weren't alone. But relief quickly gave way to something heavier. Because if Mara was watching this closely, that meant there was something worth watching. Something dangerous enough to require silence. Something already in motion. And Richard Hale, billionaire and father, realized he had entered a game where the rules were written by people who believed he would never look closely enough to notice. If you're watching this and you're already feeling the tension build, pause for just a second. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. Like this video, it helps Storesby BB reach more people who love powerful human stories like this. And hit the subscribe button because stories like this only get deeper from here. Richard returned to the garden, his hands in the dirt, his eyes on the house. Because whatever was happening to Ethan and Oliver, he was now close enough to see it. And close enough to stop it. If he survived learning the truth. Richard watched Mara more carefully now. Not casually. Not with curiosity. With intent. From the garden paths, from behind hedges, from reflections in glass doors, he observed the rhythms of the house and Mara's movements within it. And slowly, the pattern revealed itself. Mara never ate the staff meals. Not once. While the rest of the household gathered briefly in the kitchen or staff quarters, Accepting food prepared by the same hands that fed Uthan and Oliver, Mara stayed apart. She carried her own meals in sealed containers. She poured water from bottles she brought herself. She never drank from the house supply. At first, Richard told himself it was preference, dietary restrictions, personal habits. But then he noticed something else. Every time a plate was set in front of Uthan or Oliver, Mara was there. She didn't hover. She didn't interfere. She simply watched. And when she thought no one was paying attention, she reached into the lining of her apron and pulled out something thin and pale. A strip. She touched it briefly to the food. Waited. Then another. Different color. Different reaction. Chemical strips. Richard felt his pulse quicken the first time he realized what he was seeing. She wasn't checking temperature. She wasn't checking seasoning. She was testing. For what he didn't yet know, but the implication was unmistakable. At night, her vigilance intensified. Richard saw her check the twins' windows before bed, pressing the locks, tugging at frames, ensuring nothing could be opened from the outside. She closed curtains carefully, leaving no gaps. She adjusted motion sensors, just enough to avoid alerts, not enough to raise suspicion. During the day, Mara subtly controlled the twins' environment. When Uthan wandered toward a hallway that led to the medical wing, she redirected him with gentle words and a smile. When Oliver ran toward the east side of the house, she found a reason to turn him around. A game. A question. A quiet instruction. It was seamless. Invisible. Only someone actively watching would notice. Richard realized then that Mara wasn't reacting to danger. She was anticipating it. And then came the moment that erased all doubt. It happened in the late afternoon. The house doctor had just arrived. Richard was trimming hedges near an open patio door when he heard raised voices, low, controlled, but sharp with tension. Mara stood facing the doctor. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't emotional. She was firm. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her posture rigid, her voice steady but unyielding. Richard couldn't hear every word, but fragments reached him. Dosage doesn't match. They're not responding. You said it was safe. The doctor dismissed her with a wave of his hand. He spoke down to her. Cut her off. Reminded her, without saying it outright, of her place. Mara didn't back away. She stood her ground. For a moment, just a moment, Richard thought she might push further. But then she stopped. Not because she was wrong, but because she understood the danger of being right too loudly. She stepped back, lowered her eyes. The argument ended. The doctor left, and Mara turned. Her gaze landed on the gardener, on Richard, and she froze. Time seemed to stretch. The noise of the house faded. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Richard felt exposed in a way money had never allowed. Because in Mara's eyes, he saw recognition. Not of his face, but of his intent. She studied him carefully, measured him. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Just once. No fear. No surprise. As if she had known all along that someone would eventually see what she was doing. As if she had been waiting. Richard's chest tightened. In that single, silent exchange, an unspoken truth passed between them. Mara knew he was watching. And she wasn't afraid. Which meant one thing. Whatever she was protecting Uthan and Oliver from, it was already closer than anyone realized. And the maid who broke every rule wasn't doing it out of defiance. She was doing it to keep two boys alive. And Richard Hale, standing there with dirt on his hands and questions burning in his mind, understood something that shook him to his core. The most dangerous person in his house wasn't the one breaking the rules. It was the one who had written them. It happened on a night when the sky over Texas cracked open. Thunder rolled low and heavy, rattling the windows of the estate, the sound deep enough to be felt in the chest rather than heard. Rain slammed against the roof in relentless sheets, turning the manicured lawns into dark, shifting shapes under flashes of lightning. Richard Hale was outside when it began. Still dressed as the gardener. Still anonymous. Still unseen. The first flicker of power barely registered. Lights dimmed. Returned. Dimmed again. Then the alarms huckapud. Just for a second. Long enough for someone who was watching closely to notice. Richard's attention snapped toward the house. That's when he saw Mara. She wasn't walking. She was running. Not panicked, precise. She crossed the hallway with Uthan and Oliver in tow, one hand gripping each boy, her posture tight with urgency she could no longer hide. Richard dropped his tools and followed at a distance, his heart pounding harder with every step. Mara didn't take the twins toward their bedroom. She didn't take them toward the safe room Richard had designed. She veered sharply left, toward a narrow service corridor Richard had passed 100 times without noticing. She pressed her palm against the wall. A panel slid open. Richard froze. He had built this house, approved every blueprint. Yet this wasn't in his memory. Mara ushered Uthan and Oliver inside and closed the panel behind them. Without thinking, Richard moved. He slipped into the corridor just as the panel reopened from the inside. Mara stopped short when she saw him. There was no time for explanations. Thunder shook the house again. The power died completely. Darkness swallowed everything. Emergency lights flickered on inside the hidden room. And for the first time, Richard Hale saw the truth. The space was small but meticulously organized. Shelves lined the walls. Water, medical kits, portable oxygen. This wasn't storage. It was preparation. On a folding table lay binders, charts, and sealed envelopes. Mara moved quickly, guiding the twins to a bench, checking their breathing, their pupils, their pulse. Her hands were steady, experienced. Richard stepped closer, his breath shallow. He saw the papers. Medical charts bearing Uthan and Oliver's names. Dates. Times. Notes written in a careful, practiced hand. Test results highlighted in yellow. Dosages circled in red. Richard's eyes scanned the information, his mind racing. The diagnoses listed didn't match what he had been told. Not even close. He looked at Mara, then back at the pages. And slowly, painfully, the truth took shape. Ethan and Oliver weren't sick. They were being made sick. Slowly, deliberately. Low doses of substances that didn't show up in standard tests. Compounds designed to weaken, not kill. To mimic genetic illness. To create decline without triggering alarms. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't negligence. It was design. Mara reached into another folder and pulled out copies of lab requests. The same tests ordered repeatedly. Always just under the threshold of concern. Always inconclusive. Until taken together. Until someone bothered to look. Richard realized then why Mara had stayed silent. Why she had watched instead of accused. Why she had tested meals instead of refusing them outright. Because exposure, done wrong, would have ended everything. She had been buying time. Protecting the twins until proof could no longer be denied. Another thunderclap shook the house. Ethan whimpered. Oliver reached for Mara's hand. Richard saw the fear in their eyes, not of the storm, but of the confusion surrounding them. He swallowed hard. His gaze dropped to the final document in the stack. An authorization form. Not signed by a doctor. Not signed by a lab. Signed by a name Richard knew. A name he trusted. A name that had walked freely through his home. A name that had assured him everything was under control. Richard's hands began to tremble. Because betrayal hits hardest when it wears a familiar face. In that hidden room, with thunder echoing above them and the truth spread out in black ink and numbers, Richard Hale understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Money hadn't protected his sons. Power hadn't saved them. Trust had nearly destroyed them. And the storm outside was nothing compared to the one now tearing through him. Because the first truth had finally revealed itself. His enemies hadn't broken into his home. They had been invited inside. And if Mara hadn't broken every rule to protect Ethan and Oliver, Richard would have buried his children, believing he had failed them by accident. But this wasn't an accident. It was a plan. And now that Richard Hale knew the truth, there was no going back. Only forward. Into a reckoning that would tear his world apart. Mara finally spoke that night. Not to the gardener. To Richard Hale. The storm had passed, leaving the estate wrapped in a heavy, unnatural silence. The power hummed back to life, but something fundamental had shifted. The truth was no longer hidden. It was standing in the room with them. Mara closed the concealed panel behind her and leaned against it for a moment, as if steadying herself. Then she looked at Richard. Not at the disguise. Not at the dirt on his hands or the worn boots. At him. I knew, she said quietly. Richard didn't ask how. He already knew the answer. She had known the moment he stepped onto the lawn. The way he watched instead of worked. The way his eyes followed Ethan and Oliver instead of the hedges. The way he listened. Mara had seen men like Richard before, men who thought power insulated them from danger, until they realized too late that it didn't. She hadn't said anything, because saying it would have ended everything. Mara pulled a chair closer and sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For the first time since Richard had known her, her guard lowered just enough to let the truth through. She told him about her sister. Years earlier. Different city. Different house. Same pattern. A wealthy family. A trusted professional. A slow, invisible decline. Doctors blamed genetics. Specialists debated rare conditions. By the time the truth emerged, it was already too late. Her sister had died believing she was sick. The people responsible had walked away untouched. Mara had learned then what most people never do. That some crimes aren't violent. They're patient. They hide behind credentials and paperwork and polite smiles. She told Richard how she recognized the signs almost immediately in Ethan and Oliver. The subtle weakness. The inconsistent symptoms. The medications that didn't align with the diagnosis. How the dosages were just low enough to avoid detection. How everything was designed to look natural. And she explained why she hadn't gone to the authorities. Because reporting it too early would have gotten the twins killed. A sudden investigation would have forced the poison to stop or escalate. And escalation meant risk. Uncontrolled doses. Desperation. Mara had seen it happen before. So she stayed. She watched. She documented everything. Every meal. Every dose. Every reaction. She tested the food. Secured the room. Prepared the hidden pantry. She became something the job description never mentioned. A guardian. Richard listened in silence, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. Every instinct in him screamed that he should have seen this sooner, that he should have known. But knowing required looking past comfort. And he hadn't. Mara met his gaze, her expression steady but tired. "I didn't stay because of the money," she said. "I stayed because someone had to." Richard finally spoke. His voice was low, strained. "They trusted me." "So did my sister," Mara replied. The words weren't an accusation. They were a truth. She explained how close the twins had come to irreversible damage. How every night she sat on that floor, listening to them breathe, she calculated the margin for error. How one mistake, one confrontation at the wrong time could have ended everything. She hadn't broken the rules out of defiance. She had broken them because the rules were written by people who didn't understand the danger. Richard felt something fracture inside him. For the first time, he wasn't the most powerful person in the room. He was a father who had nearly lost his children. And the woman who saved them wasn't someone he had hired for protection. She was someone who had chosen it. Mara stood and moved toward the twins, checking on them once more, instinctively, as if her body didn't know how to stop being vigilant. Richard watched her and understood something profound. She hadn't stayed silent because she was afraid. She had stayed silent because she was strong enough to carry the truth alone. And in that realization, Richard Hale saw her clearly for the first time. Not as staff, not as background, but as the one person who had seen the danger coming and stood between it and his sons. Mara wasn't just a maid. She never had been. She was the reason Ethan and Oliver were still alive. And now that the truth was out in the open, the silence she had carried for so long was finally over. But what came next would be louder than anything any of them were prepared for. Richard Hale didn't confront anyone. Not the house doctor. Not the staff. Not the person whose signature now burned in his mind. Because confrontation would have ended the danger too quickly and without consequences. Instead, Richard did what he had spent his entire life mastering. He planned. He watched. He documented. And he let the people responsible believe their plan was still working. From that moment on, Richard played two roles at once. By day, he remained the gardener, invisible, overlooked, trusted with dirt and tools but never with information. By night, he became something else entirely. A witness. Every medication administered to Ethan and Oliver was logged. Every dosage photographed. Every label recorded. Mara continued her routine, unchanged on the surface, because change would raise suspicion. She tested meals. She guarded nights. She redirected the twins with the same quiet precision. And Richard watched the watchers. He noticed how the house doctor never stayed long. How he never spoke to Mara unless forced. How his visits coincided perfectly with new prescriptions. Richard noticed how reports were filed, delayed just enough to avoid scrutiny. How lab samples were sent to specific facilities. How certain results never made it back into the official records. This wasn't incompetence. It was coordination. Richard used his resources carefully. No phone calls from the house. No emails tied to his name. He moved through layers of intermediaries, old contacts he trusted because they didn't know why they were being contacted. Financial auditors flagged irregularities in billing. Medical consultants quietly reviewed anonymized data. Legal analysts traced signatures and authorizations. Each piece alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a picture too clear to deny. Someone had designed a slow decline for Ethan and Oliver. and they believed no one was paying attention. The gardener was invisible. The maid was silent. The billionaire was absent. Perfect conditions. Richard allowed it to continue, not the poisoning, but the illusion of control. Mara subtly adjusted doses when she could, enough to protect the twins without alerting suspicion. The boys improved slowly, just enough to appear stable. The house doctor grew comfortable. Confident. That confidence was the final ingredient Richard needed. Because people make mistakes when they believe they've already won. Richard recorded everything. Hidden cameras. Audio captured through walls. Time-stamped footage synced to medication logs. He waited until the pattern repeated one last time. Until the evidence was undeniable. Until the people responsible could not explain their actions away. Then and only then, Richard made a call. Not to local authorities. Not to private security. To federal investigators. The kind who don't knock politely. The kind who don't accept explanations over coffee. The morning they arrived, the house felt different. The air was tight. Footsteps echoed longer than usual. Richard was trimming hedges when the black vehicles pulled up to the gate. No sirens. No spectacle. Just calm inevitability. The house doctor arrived moments later, unaware. He barely made it past the entry hall. Agents identified themselves. Credentials flashed. Questions followed. Richard watched from the garden as confusion gave way to panic. Files were seized. Devices collected. Rooms searched. Mara stood with Ethan and Oliver, her hands resting lightly on their shoulders, her expression unreadable. The twins didn't understand what was happening. They just knew something heavy had lifted. Richard removed his cap. For the first time since he had gone undercover, he stepped forward. The agents turned. Recognition flickered across their faces. Richard Hale. The man who owned the house. The father. The witness. No one spoke for a moment. Because power looks different when it stands quietly beside the truth. The trap had worked. Not because Richard was ruthless, but because he was patient. He had allowed the plotters to expose themselves, to document their own guilt, to believe they were untouchable. And as federal agents escorted people out of the house, people who had smiled at his children, people he had trusted, Richard understood something deeply unsettling. Evil doesn't always rush. Sometimes it settles in. And the only way to defeat it is to let it believe it's safe. This wasn't the end, but it was the moment everything changed. Because the truth was no longer hidden. And the people who had underestimated a quiet maid and an absent father were about to learn just how wrong they had been. The arrests didn't happen all at once. They unfolded slowly, deliberately, like the final movement of a symphony that had been building for years. The house doctor was the first. He sat stiffly on one of the leather chairs in the living room, trying to maintain composure as federal agents laid documents across the glass table in front of him. Medication logs, lab requests, audio transcripts, time-stamped footage, each piece placed down carefully. Methodically, the doctor's confidence cracked in stages. First confusion, then irritation, then fear. He done nothing outright, not at first. He tried to explain, to rationalize, to claim protocol, procedure, professional judgment. But the evidence didn't argue. It waited. And when the agents placed the authorization forms in front of him, the ones bearing his handwriting, his codes, his timing, his shoulders sagged. The cuffs came out quietly. The sound of metal closing around his wrists echoed sharply through the marble halls. A sound that carried. A sound that Uthan and Oliver would remember long after they forgot the reason. But the doctor wasn't the end. He was the door. The next arrest didn't happen inside the house. It happened downtown, in an office overlooking the city. A man Richard Hale had known for years. A business rival. A partner once. A friend, at least publicly. Someone who had shared dinners, handshakes, and quiet laughs across polished tables. The connection was buried deep. Shell companies, medical trusts, consulting fees disguised as research grants. Money moved slowly, carefully, designed to look like coincidence. But once the trail was uncovered, it was undeniable. The rival had motive. Richard's estate was massive, but it wasn't invulnerable. Hidden within the legal framework was an inheritance clause Richard had never noticed, one drafted years earlier, buried under layers of amendments. A clause that transferred significant control if his heirs were declared, medically, unfit long-term. Not dead. Just dependent. Just incapable. A plan that didn't require violence. Just patience. Just silence. Just time. The rival had hired the doctor. The doctor had overseen the method. And the twins had been the leverage. Back at the house, agents moved room to room. Drawers opened. Computers powered down. Files boxed. The illusion of safety collapsed under fluorescent lights and official voices. Richard stood still as the truth came together. Not packing. Not shouting. Watching. Because the rage came later. In the corner of the living room stood Mara. She hadn't moved since the first set of handcuffs closed. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, as if holding herself together. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands shook, not from fear of the agents, but from release. The tension she had carried for months, years, had finally broken through. Richard saw it now. The cost. The nights on the floor. The constant vigilance. The silence. Mara hadn't just been protecting Uthan and Oliver from poison. She had been protecting herself from hope. Because hope, if it failed, would have destroyed her. An agent approached her gently, asking questions. She answered calmly. Clearly. She didn't exaggerate. Didn't dramatize. She didn't need to. Her record spoke louder than emotion ever could. Uthan and Oliver sat nearby, holding hands, watching unfamiliar adults move through their home. They didn't cry. They didn't ask questions. They just leaned toward Mara instinctively. Richard noticed that. Noted it quietly. When the final arrest was made and the house finally fell silent again, the weight of what had happened settled heavily over everything. The danger was gone, but the damage lingered. Richard walked over to Mara. She looked up at him, eyes glassy, jaw tight. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. For what? Richard didn't ask. For not telling him sooner. For breaking rules. For surviving when her sister hadn't. Richard shook his head. "No," he said simply. And for the first time since he had known her, Mara let the tears fall. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silently, as the house that had nearly destroyed 2 children finally gave up its secrets. The arrests were over. But what followed would be harder. Because justice doesn't undo fear. And saving lives doesn't erase scars. It only gives them a future in which to heal. And for Richard Hale, standing in a home that no longer felt like a fortress, one truth rang louder than the echo of handcuffs on marble. The greatest betrayal hadn't been financial. It had been personal. And the greatest act of loyalty hadn't come from contracts or security teams. It had come from a quiet woman in an apron who refused to look away. The cost of protection. Recovery didn't come overnight. It arrived quietly. Gradually, the medications were stopped. Independent specialists were brought in, people with no ties, no history, no hidden incentives. Week by week, Ethan and Oliver grew stronger. Their color returned. Their appetite followed. Their laughter came back, fuller this time, less fragile. Richard watched every change closely. Not as a billionaire. As a father who now understood how close he had come to losing everything that mattered. The house changed too. Staff were replaced. Systems rebuilt. Security redesigned from the ground up. Yet through all of it, Mara remained unchanged. She still rose early. Still tested meals. Still checked windows at night. Habit had carved vigilance into her bones. But something else changed. Mara began to pack. Quietly. Without announcement. Richard noticed small things at first. A drawer left empty. A suitcase placed neatly beneath her bed. She didn't ask for recognition. Didn't wait for gratitude. Because people who protect at that level don't do it for reward. They do it because someone has to. One evening, Richard found her in the storage pantry, the hidden room that had saved his sons. She was carefully organizing supplies. Replacing what had been used. Preparing it for someone else. "You're leaving," Richard said. Mara didn't deny it. "I always planned to," she replied. There was no bitterness in her voice. Just resolve. She explained that staying would change things. That attention followed survival. That being seen could become dangerous. She had done what she came to do. The twins were safe. That was enough. Richard realized then what the cost of protection truly was. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't fear. It was anonymity. Heroes don't stay to be celebrated. They disappear. Point 10 Nunti 00100 00. Richard's offer. Richard didn't let her leave without trying. He invited her to sit with him, not in his office, not across a desk, but at the kitchen table where Ethan and Oliver ate breakfast. He spoke plainly. Money. More than she would ever need. Security. A life where she would never have to look over her shoulder again. A new identity if she wanted it. A future without constant vigilance. Mara listened without interruption. When he finished, she shook her head. "No," she said. Not softly. Not hesitantly. Just no. Money hadn't saved her sister. Power hadn't stopped the scheme. Comfort hadn't protected the twins. Why would she believe it would protect her now? Richard pressed gently. She refused again. Because accepting the offer would turn her actions into a transaction. And what she had done for Ethan and Oliver had never been business. Mara stood, thanking him for the opportunity, and picked up her bag. Richard watched her and understood something that no balance sheet had ever taught him. You can't buy integrity. You can't purchase courage. And you can't repay someone who never asked to be paid. Mara moved toward the door. And Richard felt the same helplessness he had felt watching security footage that first night. Because once again, the person who mattered most was walking away. And he didn't know how to stop it. Not with money. Not with power. Not with offers that meant nothing to someone who had already given everything. The house felt larger as she left the room. Quieter. Because some people don't leave behind memories. They leave behind absence. And Richard Hale was about to learn just how heavy that absence could be. Mara reached the front door with her bag in her hand. The house behind her was quiet in a way it had never been before, not tense, not watchful, just empty. The kind of quiet that comes after danger has passed, when adrenaline fades and reality settles in. She placed her hand on the handle, and then she heard Richard's voice. "Wait." She turned. Richard Hale stood a few steps behind her, not in a suit, not in a position of authority, just a man standing in his own home, unsure of what words could possibly be enough. "I made the wrong offer," he said. Myra didn't respond. She had learned long ago that explanations often disguised conditions. Richard stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "I don't want you to stay as staff," he continued. "I don't want contracts or titles or obligations." Mara's grip tightened on the bag. "I want you to stay," Richard said, his voice steady but raw, "as family." The word hung in the air between them. Family. Mara looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for the edge, the leverage, the expectation that usually followed offers like this. There was none. Richard told her the truth. That Ethan and Oliver asked for her every morning. That they slept through the night only when they knew she was nearby. That in their eyes safety had a face, and it was hers. He told her that blood had failed them once already. That systems had failed. That wealth had nearly cost him everything. What hadn't failed was her. Mara shook her head slowly. "This isn't my place," she said. Richard nodded. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm asking." He explained that family wasn't something he had ever understood properly. He had grown up believing loyalty was purchased and protection outsourced. Mara had shattered that belief. She had chosen the twins without obligation. Chosen them when leaving would have been safer. Chosen them when silence was heavier than speaking. Richard made no promises of permanence. No demands. No expectations. Just an invitation. "Stay," he said again, "because they need you, and because I do too." Mara's eyes flickered toward the hallway. Ethan stood there, half hidden behind the wall, Oliver just behind him. They weren't listening. They were watching. Waiting. Mara's breath caught. She knelt in front of them, setting her bag down gently. Ethan reached for her sleeve. Oliver wrapped his arms around her waist. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The choice had already been made in their hearts. Mara closed her eyes. For years she had carried loss alone. For years she had protected others without allowing herself to be protected. Family had been something she guarded against, because losing it once had nearly destroyed her. But standing there, surrounded by a quiet house and two children who trusted her completely, she felt something unfamiliar. Possibility. Richard waited. He didn't push. Didn't fill the silence. Because real offers don't require persuasion. Mara finally nodded. Just once. Not in agreement. In acceptance. She picked up her bag, walked past Richard and placed it gently by the staircase. Not leaving. Staying. Not as staff. Not as a maid. But as something far rarer. Chosen. And in that moment, Richard Hale understood something that would redefine his life. Family isn't blood. It's the people who stay when walking away would be easier. And the quiet woman who had once watched his children sleep from the floor had become something no document could define. She had become home. The house in Texas eventually returned to what it had always appeared to be. Quiet. Immaculate. Secure. The marble floors were polished again. The gates opened and closed on schedule. The alarms worked exactly as designed. From the outside, nothing about Richard Hale's estate suggested danger. And that was the truth that stayed with him. Because the most dangerous place for a child is not always a dark alley or a broken home. Sometimes it's a beautiful one. A place where trust replaces vigilance. Where credentials replace questions. Where comfort convinces people nothing bad could possibly happen. Richard Hale never forgot how close he came to losing Ethan and Oliver. Not to strangers, not to intruders, but to people he had welcomed inside. People he had trusted. People who believed patience could achieve what violence never needed to. Ethan and Oliver grew strong. Stronger than they had ever been. Their laughter filled the house again, real laughter this time, not the fragile kind that fades too quickly. They ran through the halls, argued over toys, complained about bedtime, and asked questions only children brave enough to feel safe ever ask. And every night they slept without fear. Because Mara was there. Not watching from the floor anymore. Not hiding in the background. But present. Seen. Chosen. Mara never spoke publicly about what she did. She didn't give interviews. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't tell her story to be admired. Because she understood something most people don't. The quietest people are often the ones standing between life and death. The ones who notice patterns others ignore. The ones who stay silent not because they are weak, but because they are calculating survival. The ones who protect without applause. Richard changed after that. He no longer believed money alone could protect what mattered. He no longer outsourced responsibility without oversight. And he never again ignored the people who worked quietly in the corners of his life. Because the truth is simple. Evil rarely announces itself. It blends in. It wears professionalism. It hides behind routine. It depends on people not paying attention. And good doesn't always arrive loudly either. Sometimes it looks like a maid who stays awake all night. Sometimes it looks like a woman who breaks rules to save children who aren't hers. Sometimes it looks like someone who refuses to walk away when walking away would be easier. That truth remains. Long after the arrests. Long after the courtrooms. Long after the headlines fade. Because some stories aren't about crime. They're about courage. They're about the cost of paying attention. And they're about what happens when one person chooses to stand guard while everyone else sleeps. If this story moved you, take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Like this video, it helps Stories BBB reach more people who believe stories like this matter. And hit the subscribe button, because some stories aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to be witnessed.